So electric vehicles are kind of all the rage and also somewhat of a divisive topic. Now, this is from a purely material perspective, probably less politically charged than a lot of other things, but I'd say as an individual topic to introduce energy in a broader spectrum, EV is kind of the best place to start. Generally, people have kind of come to accept it to a degree, and while there have been criticisms of policies like California trying to stop the sale of internal combustion engines by 2030, most people don't really care about EVs, and I think that's part of the problem. So this is going to introduce the larger series of energy topics I'm going to talk about, because I think this one touches pretty much a little bit of everywhere that I want to talk about along the way. Now, if you follow me over on the community tab, you'll know that I had a poll about this, and it was actually fairly split 60-40 in favor of a series of videos. So I'm going to make this one a little longer to try to cater to the people that wanted a longer video, but I'm still going to do a series of videos, and I'll break that down more in a moment. But in terms of where I was looking kind of for inspiration and sources, I would say the single individual biggest one is Peter Zeihan. Now, of course, there's a lot of other backing information here from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the New York Times, California state government website, once again, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, and the International Energy Agency, to kind of break down how different countries utilize their power generation sector. But in terms of a video recommendation, I didn't really have a single one, because it's a fairly large topic, and there's a lot of opinions on EV, ranging from people simply not liking them to having very valid material questions as to really how effective these vehicles are. But I want to say, in terms of the best broad spectrum covering the whole topic, is kind of a addition to everything else. Peter Zeihan's book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, is probably the best single source of information if you want the kind of broad scope of things. And I greatly recommend it. You can find physical copies, but you can also find it on Audible. And it's he's a pretty good narrator as well. He narrates the book. It's quite entertaining. So why is all of this important to talk about? Why did I even bring energy up as a topic of discussion? Well, we're kind of in this transitional period of looking for alternatives to our previous, say, 100, 150 years plus of energy generation. We're looking to advance our, not necessarily capabilities to an extent, but how we get that energy. Looking for a less finite source, and that's why renewables have been pretty much a big thing since I've been alive, basically. But it's also important, in particular, starting with EVs, because it's probably the biggest single political discussion that happens. It's the biggest political buzzword for the most part. I mean, with the Biden administration pushing to have the federal fleet updated to EVs and doing a lot to broaden the infrastructure for EVs, it's kind of this thing is like, hey, Greens and more lefty people, we're doing stuff, and for the right, hey, we're building infrastructure. And, you know, it's one of those things that, much like a lot of things in politics, it's very surface level, unfortunately. But there are economic and social implications to this as well, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. And as far as a recency thing, the kind of news that spread around Twitter a couple months ago at this point, about the LK99 semi-superconductor was a pretty big deal. Now, we'll talk about why or why not that may be kind of an interesting thing, but it bringing all of this question about material science back into the light is really what pushed me to do this series of videos. So what am I going to cover over this series? Well, I'm going to start this video with EV Hill and why people are choosing to die on it, and look at the materials question, the geography and sourcing question for said materials, the power generation question, and then look at the models that California and Germany have been using. I will also dabble and touch a little bit on wind power and solar, but those are going to be their own separate video. and probably I'm going to throw other renewables in there as well, but they're going to be very minor. And then material science and nuclear will be kind of the round out to this series of videos, and of course each one will have my personal thoughts at the very end. But now you know, hey, if maybe EVs are not my thing, but I'm very interested in renewable energies and some of those questions to pop in on the next video. So the EV hill itself is effectively people wanting electric vehicles and pushing this idea that everyone needs to drive an EV. EVs are the way of the future. Electric vehicles are really the big, the best, the brightest. But a lot of people really approach this with a kind of out of sight, out of mind. They don't want to know the inputs, and they don't want to know necessarily how they're getting their electricity. They just know, hey, I'm not generating greenhouse emissions. I'm not contributing to this problem from my car. However, they don't look at the overall math of it. So if we look at materials, you can see here, by comparison, conventional cars really only use, I would never pronounce this right, molybdenum and and some manganese. Whereas if you look at electric cars, a lot of copper, or some lithium, by comparison, quite a bit, a fair bit of nickel, a lot of graphite, and some cobalt, and some other rare earth elements as well. And you see kind of the same situation down there in terms of what it takes to build different wind platforms, solar platforms, nuclear, then you have coal and natural gas at the very bottom. But the big ones, and we'll take a look at this more in a second, that we really need to focus on are things that we here in the US don't produce. Because what a lot of people fail to realize is that most of these minerals, most of these materials are imported. Or they're imported to the country that ends up building the car, depending on which car it is. And most of those countries do not have a green grid. The extracting process, the refining process, and the actual manufacturing of these cars puts them in a much bigger deficit off of the bat than your conventional combustion engine vehicles. Now, that coupled with a couple of other things we'll look at later really brings into question how actually beneficial electric cars, EVs, are to reducing our dependency on fossil fuels or dirtier types of fuel. But the big ones we're going to focus on: graphite, nickel, copper, zinc, and manganese. So in terms of sourcing these, this is a fun little chart here, and I've got the same little chart there for what electric vehicles use. As we see here, starting with copper, which was a big deal for solar and electric, mind you. The primary sources that actually develop or that produce this, Chile, Peru, China, Democratic Republic of Congo, and the U.S. makes up about 6% of the global supply. Now, in terms of importing, China, Japan, and Korea make up the largest individual contributor, largest importers of it. However, this is pretty much the only one we have a foothold in. That's kind of a problem. This is something that you do not have EVs, you do not have windmills, you do not have solar farms without copper. Now, if you look at that chart, Chile, Peru, China, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, none of those have green grids, and for the most part, they're all fairly dirty grids, especially China. Now, we should also mention this is where the individual materials are extracted, not necessarily where they're refined, but if you look at the importers, that's where you're looking at more of kind of the refining aspect. And copper is not necessarily as bad about this as some other ones, but it's still something to consider when you're looking at all these other materials that go into this, and these processes of extracting and refining are not typically clean processes. Now, if we look at nickel there, which is kind of your darker green, we see that nickel is coming from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Russia. So that 11% from Russia, you can kind of get gone at this point. With their whole invasion of Ukraine, they're not nearly the global supplier they used to be. However, they're still exporting for a good portion of it to China, which imports 74% of the overall global nickel supply, Canada at 6%, and Finland at 6%, both of which are probably not at least importing as much, or if at all, depending on. The sanctions can get kind of weird with some of these materials, but generally speaking, those three countries also not clean grids. Nickel's a little bit harder to handle, but it's not as, once again, not the most elaborate refining process, but it is a process. So extracting, fairly dirty process. Refining, fairly dirty process. And when you look at kind of final manufacturing locations, a large bit of it being China, their grid's not very green either. Now, if we look at graphite, which is the next big one, which is kind of your beige color there, graphite is not on this list, but it's another one of those that is a bit of a problem. Now, it's not something that the U.S. is big on, but with the push for EVs, we're going to need a lot of it, as we can see via that chart. However, lithium is probably the next single biggest one, mostly for the fact for batteries. Now, it doesn't make up the next largest chunk, but it is probably the most essential out of that grid. And as we see there, Australia is actually coming in clutch for us on that one. Australia, Chile, and China. Now, of course, most of the imports are going to Korea and Japan. But once again, a lot of these cars are going to end up in the U.S. from at least this video's perspective. But even if they're not, and they're in these other countries, you're still looking at extracting, refining, and actually manufacturing these batteries being a much more elaborate process than you have for most of your refining processes of natural gas and oil. So, not only do you need more materials to make EVs, and most of these materials do not come natively from the US and generally do not come from our close trade relations, but the process to refine them, the process to extract them, are putting EVs at a deficit before they even reach the floor. Now, in terms of general power generation, this is the U.S. energy consumption grid per source in 2019. So some of this has changed a little bit, but not like a massive amount. As we can see, renewables make up a very small degree of it, nuclear power being even less. But petrol is going to be the single largest chunk, which is why people approach EVs as this solution, right? It's not a fix-all. It's not going to drastically change how things go, but it does cut down on this big red block here. A lot of it also goes to transportation, but you do have some industrial, residential, and commercial use, as well as electricity generation. So it is going to take a big portion of it out. The problem is petroleum, well, it does pose a problem, is not the single biggest problem, right? Because effectively what you're doing, you're probably bumping up renewables a little bit, but coal and natural gas are probably going to get bigger in that overall. We do not currently have the capacity in any state, any part of the country, to run purely off a renewable grid. Now, I know you're saying, hey, we're working on it. Sure. But we also have to understand that renewables do not necessarily make up the entirety of what we can capably generate. That is a problem. And we'll talk about it more when we talk about wind and solar, but you know, as much of a straw man argument as it is to say, oh, how are you going to use solar power when the lights go out, like at night and stuff? There is a certain point, right? You don't want to put a big solar farm in a place that is not typically sunny. You also don't want to put windmills in a place that doesn't have a lot of wind. Now, the U.S. is pretty fortunate in this general regard that we do have places that are pretty sunny pretty consistently, and we have a fairly good range of areas that work for windmills. Part of the problem is those generally are not located close to major metropolitan areas, so transmission is a bit more of a problem. We don't have lossless transmission, which is why the LK99 superconductor was a little bit of an interesting conversation. We'll talk about it more in a different video, but generally speaking, the idea of cutting petroleum down doesn't necessarily mean we're adding renewables on top of that simply because it's EV. EVs do not produce their own power. They still need a source of power, and the biggest, easiest way to expand in the short term is natural gas. Now, in terms of power generation, we kind of get to look at the California model. California's been this big push on banning the sale of internal combustion engine cars by 2035. So, they still have like 12 years at this point to get there. And that is pretty substantial, right? They want 35% of new sales to be, they want 35% of new overall car sales in California by 2026 to be the 35%. And that's a pretty steep climb 4 years later. But currently, 18.8% of new car sales in California, at least in 2022, were EVs. So there is a pretty big jump you're going to have to make. You're going to have to roughly double the amount of EV sales in the next 3 years, or 2 years. Yeah, 2 years. And then by 2030, you're going to need that number doubled again. So this is a strange approach. Like, I understand why people kind of like this idea, but we also have to understand that the way California, and to an extension the EU and Germany work very similarly, this is not necessarily a full California state government situation, right? They have a board that's appointed for this process that sets these guidelines. So generally, they are not elected officials. These are appointed positions. The California Air Resource Board is who sets these requirements and monitors them. Generally speaking, when you've looked at different things in the past, these types of structures are, hey, shoot for the moon or aim for the stars, hit the moon or whatever, right? We're really going to try to hit this pretty crazy number. And at the very least, we're going to do better than we would have otherwise. However, California doesn't really come clean when they talk about their energy production. So if we look here, natural gas is by far the absolute biggest. Now, they do generate some natural gas as well, but they import a large degree of that. Then you have different distilleds of fuels, whether that is gasoline with ethanol, distilled fuel oil, or jet fuel. And if you kind of go all the way down towards the bottom there, you see other renewables. So that's not going to include hydroelectric, but it's going to pretty much include everything else. California is probably one of the best single locations in terms of having a combination of both wind and solar capabilities. And that's what they're at. Just let that sink in for a moment. I mean, sure, this is 2020, so it's been 3 years. But effectively what you're doing, as I said in the previous slides, even if you're taking a chunk out of that motor gasoline, excluding ethanol in that instance, it is not going to renewables because you're driving an EV. Some of it may, if you expand that capability, but most of it's probably going to come from natural gas sources that are probably imported. One thing that the EU, Germany, California really get by on is when they say, oh, our grid is getting cleaner every day. We're so close to zero emissions or being balanced or whatever phrase they want to use that week, because they only count what they internally generate. Having a fairly robust capability to use solar and wind power, they're starting in a much larger advantage than most states. Now, of course, they also have a larger populace, so their energy requirements are higher. But if it's generated outside California, they don't typically count it when they're having these discussions. Because, well, we're not generating it. We're not getting the natural gas. We're just getting the energy from it. The plant's not in California, right? Now, transmission across that range, depending on where it is a whole nother issue that is a bit of a problem. But this should tell you everything you need to know. Even if you're going EV, you are not necessarily adding more renewable energies to this. Because renewable energies take a while to spin up. Now, not necessarily as long as like nuclear or something like that, but you already have the ability to use natural gas as an energy source, and it's not in your state, so you don't necessarily care about it because out of sight, out of mind. Let's just import more natural gas. Well, we quote unquote build more renewable sites, which may or may not work all that much better. Now, if we look at the German model, we get to see that Germany likes to think they can try the same thing, but don't necessarily have the same capability for generation power. So, as we look at these charts here, they don't really have the same capabilities for solar or wind. Wind, they're a little bit closer, but not by a whole lot. Having the Northern European plain going through a good portion of Germany, they do have a decent area of moderate and ideal wind conditions to generate electricity. The problem is if you start looking at the rest of Europe, it's patches of red and orange. You know, if you look at Spain, Spain's not in a great situation. Germany's probably the single best if you're not looking outside, like the UK is a little different, obviously, but if we're talking EU, they are probably the single best, and outside of maybe Poland. They still are importing a lot of energy. I mean, this was a whole big deal when the Russians invaded Ukraine and it started becoming a political issue. The Germans losing natural gas access from Germany really went to show, hey, natural gas makes up one of the largest sectors of our overall energy consumption. And you can see this from 1990 to 2000 or to 2021. Natural gas has a big spike in 2020, right? Nuclear starts to decline around that time. Wind and solar get a little bit bigger. Biofuels and waste get a little bit bigger. Coal takes a bit of a dip. But oil, while it's on a downtrend, is largely consistent. So not only is the German energy sector having to rely on Norway's natural gas production, they don't really have the means to not rely on it, right? Even with those ideal and moderate areas for wind power generation, that is not enough to sustain their entire population, especially if they're driving EVs. Now, if everyone's riding a bike, that's different. Bikes don't require energy, or if they're like motorized, it's very minor. By comparison, a car, it's going to require a fair bit of that. So once again, just going to the point, that oil, as long as it continues to decline, is probably going to be supplemented largely by natural gas, or to an extent at this point coal, versus wind and solar. Because there will be a point the Germans have to refine their existing windmills to be more efficient because they do not have any more areas that they can reliably generate wind energy. So what are we talking about practical issues with EVs? Because so up to this point, if you're okay with the whole out of sight, out of mind approach, I'm not generating any greenhouse gases. I am zero emissions. Great. You also have other issues to worry about. Fire hazards being one of them. Now, I'm not going to go out here and say that EVs are catching on fire left and right, but I will say when one does, it is very different in terms of how the fire works. Having all these different materials being put into EVs, they are much more akin to a difficult chemical fire, right? And largely not one you can put out. with a reasonable amount of water that a fire truck could put out, right? So you'll see a lot of EVs like this entirely burnt out. You also have construction that comes up after that because it usually messes with the asphalt below it. But when it's a fire hazard, it's a massive one. It's not a, hey, this truck's on fire, we'll have a fire truck to come put it out. It's, oh, this EV is going to be on fire for the next few hours until it burns itself out. We can kind of just help. Now, outside of that, you also have weight issues. Having so many more minerals, these cars are generally, depending on, by comparison, heavier. Which is not necessarily a horrible thing in terms of being a driver. However, if everyone is driving heavier cars, we're going to start having more issues with bridges and just our general roadway infrastructure. We already have some of the most concerning bridge conditions in the world. Why not add a few hundred, if not 1,000 pounds to a vehicle and have everyone drive them, right? Now, once again, I understand this is something that it's like, oh, well, we can fix the roads. We can't fix the environment. Sure, to an extent. But we also have to understand that you're already starting at a deficit in terms of your actual carbon footprint by the point that you get to drive it. The more we have to repair roads, which not only cuts down on productivity, it's a whole thing, but generally the production of asphalt is not super clean either. And once again, you have to look at your energy production sources. Most of the time, even in the cleanest state in the country, it is not necessarily a renewable energy source. Now, on top of that, probably the most common issue that you'll probably see with being a driver of one of these is the battery degradation. Now, even if you don't have an EV, you understand this concept because pretty much everyone has a cell phone. And most cell phones at this point now have a feature to where you can look at your battery health. Having known this for a while, we absolutely understand that, hey, lithium-ion batteries or lithium batteries do not hold their full capacity. If you've had a laptop, if you've had a cell phone, if you've had a tablet, you know that eventually it's going to get to the point where it does not fully charge. These usually will drop down. Of course, it depends on brand and model, of course. But generally, the charts that I've seen out there have most of these models dropping to 90% of capacity within the first 2 to 5 years. Now, is that irritating as a driver because you have less range? 100%. Is this infuriating because your value proposition, your asset in this car, the value of said asset, goes down significantly worse than your regular internal combustion engine cars? Right? Now, EVs being all the rage, being political, being kind of a social thing, you don't necessarily see that happening right now. But the aftermarket, the used market for these electric cars is not going to be something that's hot. Because, yeah, I mean, if it starts out you have 400 miles of range and say you have it for 8 to 10 years, that battery's range may be anywhere from 60 to, if you're lucky, maybe 80% of its original range, right? So if you live in a city, you don't drive all that often, or, you're not driving far distances in single goes, that's fine. But this is something that we've not seen a direct comparison to necessarily with internal combustion engines. And next we get to recyclability. Now, one of the actual kind of benefits I suppose you have here is that, bringing these EVs in is largely the upfront cost of this whole process, because most of these materials that we're looking at, outside of silicone being probably the biggest one, most of them are recyclable to a very high degree, right? I mean, currently, steel is probably the best example of a material that's effectively entirely recyclable, right? You don't have a massive degradation in terms of quality whenever you recycle it. Most of the materials we looked at in the previous slides are going to be the same way. Lithium is a little different, silicone's a little different, but generally speaking, everything else is pretty high up there. So if it's here and we can recycle it, we do have a larger supply readily available to us. So we do have that capability to manufacture these in the future. But part of the problem that I've had with EVs is that even if you're doing that, you're not necessarily fixing the problem, right? Now, if you use those materials to expand our green grid, our solar, our wind generation, sure, great, more power to you. But the whole point of this is that even if we have the materials to have these EVs built in other countries, import them or build them here, depending on, we will hit a cap on how much generation we have from solar and wind. Now, sure, we can work to refine those, make them more efficient, either make taller windmills or more efficient solar panels or putting them in better positions. The problem largely becomes that is a material science question, not an EV question. And outside of like the discussion of the LK99 stuff, which isn't necessarily all that new of a study, we don't really talk about material science. So, largely speaking, EVs do have some benefit, but definitely not to the degree that everyone makes a big deal about them. So, kind of my personal thoughts on this, and this will kind of largely be the same for each one of these because they tie into this larger picture of energy generation and green energy and all that. Green's not bad, but we need to understand, and especially as like kind of the green movement needs to understand, it's not the only option, and it's not going to be the only option, right? Cleaner natural gases are great, especially in the short term for conversion purposes. Nuclear is probably going to be one of the larger sources we're going to need in the near future. Without material science, green energy does not happen. We do not currently have the technology, the capability to, even if we just say entirely defunded any kind of subsidies we had or tax breaks we had to the oil and gas industry and put them all towards green energy in terms of just building new stuff, we would not be making the difference that the Greens think we do, unfortunately. Now, not a bad option. I'm not saying we don't pursue this, but this needs to be done pretty much with the spearheading of material sciences, right? More effective windmills, more recyclable solar panels, and we'll talk about that in a different video. More effective solar panels, better placement, and really just trying to find more efficient methods of storage and transmission. As kind of the geopolitical sense of this, energy policy is largely politicized, oddly enough. But energy generation shouldn't be, right? Which is where we've kind of started to see this whole discussion and this whole cultural approach to green kind of start to shift as we've started to see more green energy sector jobs crop up. It's less politicized because most of the people that would have concerns about green energy are now working in that sector, right? If you're kind of looking at the approach of people who are economically affected by windmills or by solar farms or whatever, generally you're looking at people that work in oil and natural gas, whether it's people working out in the fields, whether you're looking at engineers, whether you're looking at corporate people at that point, or anyone in those organizations. You know, it's not one-to-one, but you do have the capability to change and pivot into one of these positions. And the more that begins to happen, the less of a political powder keg green energy is. However, energy policy is always going to be a political topic because, I mean, that's what policy is, right? And we should really come to the understanding that as much as maybe I've sounded like I'm talking down to people who like EVs, shaming people's not going to work, right? We've tried it for pretty much my entire life and it has not worked. So whether you're on the side of greens and EVs and saying, hey, how dare you drive an internal combustion engine car, which, why are you saying it that way? But whatever, it doesn't matter. People are just going to harden in that position and say, oh, I'm going to keep doing it, right? Like, it is overall cheaper and easier most of the time. And, you know, this is something that kind of ties into that energy policy of trying to stop the sale of internal combustion engine cars in, like, California. People are going to go out of state to buy a car. You have effectively handicapped your entire car sales sector in California, which for a large population is a bit of a problem. But you're going to see other states benefit fairly greatly from that. Now, from the other side, people kind of saying, hey, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And you're kind of trying to paint Greens and liberals as snowflakes or whatever. Both sides need to just come at this and, like, stop trying to say, hey, you're bad. Just state why you like it, right? For EV people, your priority obviously is, hey, I want to help the environment, even if you're not thinking is a broader picture, but you are not, from a driving perspective, emitting emissions, and you're cool with that. But you also have to understand there are people who drive, much like myself, an internal combustion engine car and probably will continue to do so because it is cheaper. It is easier. It's more readily available, right? It functions better from a actual distance perspective. So if I need to drive a distance, and I do commute fairly long ways, I kind of need that, right? So as things get more efficient and, you know, maybe we get that route, it's a little different. But I want to just take this time in this video to say EVs are not what you think they are. Are they bad to pursue? Not necessarily. But they are not the end-all be-all. They are not the silver bullet. And in their current capacity, they're actively more of a problem than they are a solution. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me here for about 40 minutes. I do greatly appreciate it. I will see you guys in the next one.